Analysis. Children in Immigration Enforcement Operations. Sacordias. Background and overview. Recent immigration enforcement operations in the Minneapolis area have raised questions about federal policy and practice when children are present during arrests of parents or guardians with removal orders. The most prominent case involves a 5-year-old boy, Liam Conejo Ramos, who was taken into federal custody alongside his father on January 21st, 2026, after agents attempted to arrest the father outside their Columbia Heights home. According to the family's attorney, Mark Prokosh, the family arrived from Ecuador in December 2024 and presented themselves to border officers in Texas to apply for asylum, entering through legal processes for asylum seekers. The father, Adrian Alexander Conejo Arias, was subsequently released into the United States under the previous administration pending immigration proceedings. The Department of Homeland Security states that the father was the intended target of the enforcement operation. The incident occurred when the child returned home from preschool. According to School District Superintendent Zina Stanvik, the child was removed from the family's running vehicle. Federal agents reportedly asked the child to knock on the door to determine if anyone else was home. The mother did not exit the residence to take custody of the child, and both father and son were transported to the South Texas Family Residential Center in Dilley, Texas, where they remained detained together. This case is part of broader enforcement activities in Minnesota, where the school district reports that 4 students have been detained by ICE, including a 17-year-old taken while en route to school, another 17-year-old and her mother, detained from their apartment, and a 10-year-old 4th grader, detained with her mother 2 weeks prior. Says Supporters' perspective. Thars, enforcement of lawful orders. Supporters of current enforcement practices argue that immigration agents are executing lawful removal orders issued through proper legal channels. They contend that individuals with final removal orders have exhausted their legal processes, and that enforcement must proceed regardless of family circumstances. From this perspective, the presence of children does not negate the legal obligation to enforce immigration law. Child welfare prioritization. Federal officials maintain that officers acted with the child's welfare as their primary concern. Vice President J.D. Vance, speaking in Minneapolis, framed the situation as agents preventing potential harm. What are they supposed to do? Are they supposed to let a 5-year-old child freeze to death? DHS stated that officers made multiple attempts to get the mother inside the house to take custody of her child, and even assured her that they would not take her into custody. Remorse. Parental responsibility. Supporters argue that responsibility for the child's situation lies with the parents, rather than enforcement agents. ICE posted on social media that the child was abandoned, suggesting that the father's actions and the mother's refusal to take custody created the circumstances, requiring agents to take the child into protective custody. DHS stated that officers abided by the father's wishes to keep the child with him after the mother declined to accept custody. Nashir. Legal pathway violations. From the enforcement perspective, the father was released under the previous administration, but failed to comply with immigration requirements, necessitating arrest. Supporters of robust enforcement argue that even those who initially enter through asylum processes must comply with subsequent legal determinations and removal orders. Success. Maintaining deterrence. Those supporting current enforcement intensity argue that consistent application of immigration law, regardless of family circumstances, maintains the integrity of the legal system and deters future unauthorized presence. They contend that creating exceptions based on the presence of children would undermine enforcement effectiveness. Sawyas. Critics' perspective. Orhawks. Trauma to children. Critics express deep concern about the psychological impact on children involved in enforcement operations. Stanvik characterized the use of the child to knock on the door as essentially using a 5-year-old as bait. Child development experts and advocates warn that detention and separation from familiar environments can cause lasting developmental and emotional harm to young children, regardless of whether they remain with a parent. Sakshias. Targeting of asylum seekers. Opponents note that the family entered the country through legal asylum processes. Prokosh emphasized, these are not illegal aliens. They came properly. They came legally and are pursuing a legal pathway. Critics argue that enforcement actions against asylum seekers who presented themselves to authorities contradicts stated policy goals of encouraging legal pathways to immigration. Smachiers. Disproportionate tactics. Civil liberties advocates characterize the enforcement approach as excessive, particularly regarding minors. Pastor Sergio Amezcua, who has been assisting the family, stated that ICE is acting worse than the cartels in Mexico. Critics point to the use of armed, masked agents in residential areas during school drop-off times as unnecessarily militarized and traumatizing for communities. Arse, community fear and disruption. Opponents argue that aggressive enforcement tactics create fear that extends beyond targeted individuals. The mother's refusal to exit the home, according to advocates, stemmed from reasonable fear of detention despite assurances. Amezcua noted that neighbors advised her not to do it, fearing she would be detained, and that she is pregnant with another teenage son dependent on her care. Muir sons. Educational disruption. School officials express concern about the impact on students and educational environments. Stanvik reported that 4 students from one district have been detained, including children taken while traveling to school. Critics argue that enforcement operations near schools and during school hours disrupt education and create anxiety among student populations. Yasasamchir. Questionable criminal basis. The family's attorney stated that the father does not appear to have a criminal record in Minnesota, raising questions among critics about enforcement priorities. Opponents argue that resources should focus on individuals who pose public safety threats rather than asylum-seeking families without criminal histories. Zashuris. Practical implications for everyday life. For mixed-status families, the case illustrates challenges facing families, where members have different immigration statuses. The mother and teenage son remain in Minnesota, while the father and 5-year-old are detained in Texas. Families must navigate difficult decisions about whether to remain together if it means entering detention or separating to preserve some members' freedom. For school communities, educational institutions face unprecedented situations regarding student attendance and welfare. Schools must determine how to support students whose family members are detained, maintain educational continuity for absent students, and address trauma and anxiety among the broader student population witnessing enforcement activities. Swaushior. For community dynamics, enforcement operations have prompted community responses, including warning systems, neighbor mobilization, and decisions about when to intervene in enforcement actions. The case demonstrates how immigration enforcement affects entire neighborhoods, not just targeted individuals, creating tensions between cooperation with authorities and community solidarity. Yakshas. For parents' decision-making, parents in immigrant communities must make real-time decisions with significant consequences during enforcement encounters. The mother faced the choice between potentially being detained, herself leaving 2 children without parents, or refusing to exit, which resulted in her young son being taken to Texas. These no-win scenarios affect daily activities like school, drop-off, and routine errands. Jaker, legal and institutional considerations. Asylum process questions. The case raises questions about how asylum seekers who present themselves legally should be treated during pending proceedings. While the family entered through established legal channels, the father's subsequent release and apparent removal order indicate a complex legal trajectory that resulted in enforcement action. The relationship between asylum claims and enforcement priorities remains a subject of legal and policy debate. Successors, parental rights and child welfare. The situation presents competing legal frameworks: Immigration Enforcement Authority, parental rights to custody of children, and child welfare obligations to prevent abandonment. Federal officials assert they acted to protect the child's welfare, while critics question whether detention serves children's best interests. Courts have not fully resolved how these frameworks interact during immigration enforcement. Yibam. Detention of minors. The Dili facility is designed as a residential center for families, rather than a criminal facility with educational and recreational spaces. However, critics note it remains detention regardless of conditions. Legal questions persist about appropriate standards for detaining children, duration limits, and alternatives to detention for families with pending cases.